It's nearly 3 weeks since Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group pointed their tanks towards Moscow and were branded traitors and mutineers by the government. But now there's a new twist. Turns out that 5 days after the episode, in which more than a dozen Russians were killed, Wagner's boss, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was having talks with Putin in the Kremlin. What does it all mean? My guest is Russian political scientist Ekaterina Schulmann, now based in Berlin.
The president is still in his place. The system has survived. So far, no personal changes has occurred at all.
So how many more surprises can we expect from this so-called rebellion? How damaged are the power structures inside the Kremlin? Is Putin really in charge or being dragged along by events that he no longer controls? This drama appears far from over. Ekaterina Schulmann, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Thank you.
So now we learn that 5 days after he led a supposed rebellion, set off in a convoy for Moscow and got branded a traitor, Yevgeny Prigozhin was sitting chatting with the president in the Kremlin. Another day, another version full of holes, question marks, contradictions. What do you make of all this?
Well, it's not a happy topic to comment upon for me as either a Russian citizen or a former Russian civil servant, which I was for quite some years, because it does seem rather an extraordinary meeting in all senses of the word. It's extraordinary in its essence. It's also extraordinary in the informational wrapping. The Kremlin was denying the fact that it knew about Prigozhin's whereabouts about the same days, it appears, when he was actually in the Kremlin. And the very fact of the president meeting with a leader of armed rebels, and not just himself alone, like, Napoleon going to visit Georges Cadoudal in his cell, but equipped with, as Kremlin says, 35 of his followers, that does not look very much like the leader of the nation receiving the penitent ex-mutineer, but rather like the heads of two gangs coming together to discuss their mutual interests, their businesses, the division of assets, and such like matters. I was always saying that every chair of Russian studies or every Russia-oriented think tank should have a criminologist on its staff. It will help to clarify matters.
But what do you draw from all this, at least the chaotic messaging, that the system is in free fall, overcome by panic or inertia, that it's been seriously weakened, that the wheels are coming off? What should we be thinking?
Well, that may be rather too strong language just at present, although in a couple of months' time it may be much closer to the truth. The system, as I see it, is certainly not going to get any stronger. The messaging, for that matter, is not getting more coherent at all. It is strange that days after, or actually almost immediately after this meeting in the Kremlin, the smear campaign started on federal state TV against Prigozhin, and a very interestingly oriented campaign at that. There was not much talk about the treason or about stabbing the army at the back, or about his being connected with the West, which is usually the favorite topic of Russian propaganda, or even of his being the Ukrainian spy, but it was all about the money. He was portrayed as a person who made enormous profits from the Russian state and then literally beat the hand that fed him, which is very much at cross purposes with the whole patriotic war messaging, unification of the nation messaging, the idea that Russia is at some sort of existential struggle with the West for its very existence based on its values. So now we have, and again, not just we perceive it with the analysts, with the Russia watchers, but the TV watcher is supposed to see a commercial conflict, in fact. Another oligarch who has made himself rich on the state budget and then got ambitions for something political. In fact, something like another Khodorkovsky or Berezovsky, with due respect to the military atmosphere. So it's like Khodorkovsky with tanks.
Except that this oligarch has forces that are probably better trained than any other in Russia at the moment and would be seen by Putin as vital to the war effort in Ukraine. That's his strong point, isn't it? That's Prigozhin's strong point.
Yes, I'm not capable of judging of his military capability. That's not the kind of thing I understand very much about, but he certainly has an army of his own, which is loyal to him and not to anyone else, and for very valid reasons, because their very existence is illegal in the eyes of the Russian law. There is no law about private military companies, but there are a couple of criminal code articles exactly describing what they're doing, and these involve quite heavy punishments from 10 to 15 years of penal service. So again, for the Russian law, for the Russian state machine, these people are criminals. Even if the president receives them in the Kremlin, they still have no legal footing. So their loyalty can be only to the chief that pays them and protects them from the law. And this chief is strong enough to manage to get a meeting with the president in order to, bargain evidently with him also about the fate of his followers.
Are you not surprised that Prigozhin is still alive?
I'm surprised at the whole thing. But once you start doing crazy stuff, like beginning a war with your neighbor, all sorts of crazy consequences emerge. So we started being surprised on the 24th of February and haven't finished yet.
Tatiana Stanova from the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center says Russian elites are in a state of silent shock. They're asking themselves, how was it possible to get out of such a mutiny unpunished? Do you have an answer to that?
Well, I don't do psychological analysis at long distance, but again, being something of a bureaucrat myself at heart, I can relate to this state of things. We do not know really much about Russian elites. It's a closed community. They do not readily communicate. But certainly the things which are happening are rather out of the ordinary. But again, we are dealing with so many myths and so many propaganda concepts, handmade illusions, that I'm wondering whether the illusion of this idea of the strong and vindictive president who does never forgive treason, who is ever ready to avenge humiliation, whether it was kind of true during peaceful times when oil prices were high and relations with the outside world were good, whether it still holds true during this time when it seems that his only goal is political survival. If we think that this is the goal, then everything else becomes rational and explainable.
Are you talking about a new Putin whose political opponents don't, for some reason, jump out of their upstairs windows with quite the frequency with which they have in recent years?
We'll have to wait and see. But so far, well, yes, some people have jumped out of windows. Other people have emigrated and lived rather peacefully abroad. Other people have been killed or otherwise molested abroad. So I do not exactly see any coherent policy here either. But of course, a very open-faced threat like an armed mutiny is something different from even attempting to buy your own parliamentary fraction, which is what Khodorkovsky was actually accused of in political terms. This is something new. All other threats or perceived threats from the military side were indeed punishable by death. We could remember the cases of General Lebed, who could have been perceived as something of a rival. There was a less known case of General Rokhlin, who was found dead in his bed and his wife accused of murder. So military was always perceived by actually Soviet political leadership as potentially dangerous and not to be trusted. This is a tradition stemming from the end of the Second World War, when Stalin was afraid of the popularity of Marshal Zhukov and of actual political importance of the army that just won the historic victory. Since then, it has been a tradition that secret services are political actors, but the army and the navy are not. Even during the war, we have not yet seen any change in this direction. Prigozhin and his boys do not represent the military exactly, but they certainly represent the military force. And you see that while peaceful political opposition is being systematically crushed, if you have a tank and a couple of guns, then you can get yourself invited to the Kremlin, and you get talked with in quite respectful manner. I'm not sure that this is a good.
That's a risky
Yes.
precedent to set, isn't it? That's a very risky precedent.
The point. Yes. But once you find yourself as a state, as a leader in the troubled waters of the war that you can neither win nor put an end to, you get all sorts of queer guests in your cabinet.
When all the spin and exaggeration are stripped away, what do you think was really behind Prigozhin's so-called march for justice? Was it opportunistic? Do you believe that despite his assurances, he had an intention of actually ousting Putin?
If we strip all the paraphernalia away from this, we see a very typical event that happens in Africa about every 6 months.
In Africa, but not in Russia.
Why should we think ourselves so different? Because the territory is bigger, because the climate is different, well, because we have more cities and universities, but sadly, this seems to be no obstacle to, well, political degradation, to put it in simple terms. So these things happened in the countries that cannot hold their legal violence together. So there emerges other alternative forces, which then demand something from the government. Usually, the beginning of such a revolt, which can or cannot terminate in a change of power, is dissatisfaction with payment, with leadership, with working conditions, something or other. So it's a kind of labor conflict, again, only with tanks. So you start frightening your government with yourself and your supporters in the hope of getting better working and living conditions, or just getting more money, or to have your grievances listened to. So political science tells us that despite the very armed and violent appearance of such marches, the leaders are actually anxious to avoid bloodshed whenever possible, because their goal is bargaining, not actual regime change. Although if regime is weak enough at that point and people who organize the mutiny cannot directly access or understand how weak it really is, regime change may occur.
Ekaterina Schulmann, one of the most extraordinary aspects of this saga is that Prigozhin was able to trash Putin's entire justification for invading Ukraine, calling it a lie. How damaging were those comments? He hasn't withdrawn them.
No, he has not. And in his recent, the most recent of his public appearances, so those voicemails he's been sending to the nation through Telegram that happened before the mutiny, he went from attacking the Minister of Defense leadership to actually attacking, well, not the president by name, but him as the head of the system. The justification for the march was seeking for justice, protesting against corruption, and the need to change this whole system, which is not effective. The system is the president, or the president exemplifies and symbolizes the system. So you cannot say that it was just an appeal for the president's arbitrage in his quarrel with the Minister of Defense and the head of General Headquarters. He went higher than that. And yes, it was extraordinary to hear him saying that NATO was not actually planning to attack Russia, that Ukraine was not planning to attack Russia, that it was all a tale spinned by the army leadership for the president in order to get more medals and more budget money. This message has been heard by those that get the information from Telegram. And this is a big and growing chunk of Russian population. It has not been heard at all, but by those whose main source of information is TV.
We talked a little bit about how the effects of all this on the system. Can you, to any extent, quantify the damage that the system has sustained with this episode? And what early signs would you be looking for if the system were to unravel further? How might that manifest itself?
First things first, the president is still in his place. The system has survived. So far, no personal changes has occurred at all, either in the Kremlin, broadly understood, or in the Ministry of Defense, or for the matter of that, in Wagner. So it looks like for the moment we have this uneasy equilibrium where everyone got their own. Prigozhin seems to be losing his media empire, or at least putting it on hold because the information is really very muddled. We cannot be sure.
But if it
I do
goes
not.
wrong
Mhm,
from here, what would we be
mhm.
seeing? What would
So
we
again,
should we
we
be
have the,
looking
the
out for?
uneasy status quo just for the moment. What will be the signs that unraveling goes further? Well, I would expect in this case, the bad example of Prigozhin to be followed by somebody else. It may start low key with, for example, videotaped addresses of some military personnel to the president and or to the minister of defense. Again, listing some grievances and asking to be listened to. Or we may witness elite defections on a higher level than previously. For example, somebody from the government or formerly from the government may disappear and then appear on the other side of the border, ready maybe to talk about something, to make some public declarations, or to make non-public communications with the authorities of, say, European Union or United States. Or we may see some leaks on the level of this leaked phone conversation between Mr. X and Mr. Z, saying something. By the way, speaking about leaks, which are a sign of the system not being able to do what it most prides itself on doing, preserve the secrecy. The information about the meeting of the president with the Wagner people was published by the French newspaper Libération. And after that, Kremlin had to, again, it's not clear for me why they could have kept denying it. It's no problem for them to deny anything, but they, for some reason, thought themselves obliged to actually confirm that the meeting took place. It means that somebody over there in a very close circle in the Kremlin is talking to, well, somebody who is then talking to the mainstream European press. This is a sign.
You characterized the Russian state recently as a system mostly based on imitation, make-believe, hypocrisy, and lip service. Isn't that pretty much the way it was in Soviet times? So could this system collapse the way the Soviet Union did?
The Soviet Union had a couple of other things, like coherent ideology, absolutely closed borders, and centralized economy. This made it at once durable and brittle. It happens with such unnatural systems. Our current system enjoys a more or less market economy, a more or less functional system of civic bureaucracy, which actually holds the country together, and the advantage of open borders, which allows to get rid of dissent without direct and widespread violence. So it is not a Soviet system, but it has quite a lot of similarities with the late version of Soviet regime when it was almost all pretense. No belief in ideology any longer, not much violence exercised by the state, and absolutely no enthusiasm on the part of the people about anything. And last but not least, dissatisfaction of the elites with the way they live and the spreading idea that change may be to their advantage.
Dissatisfaction of the elites. According to some reports, a number of security personnel called in sick on the 24th of June, not wanting to show which side they were on in case things got out of control. Another report said these were Moscow police officers hedging their bets just as they had in 1991 during the attempted coup against Mikhail Gorbachev. Was there a lot of that happening on June the 24th? And is this a police state that can't rely on its police any longer?
Well, again, to an extent it can. As you see, there were no open defections. No one united himself or no armed body united itself with the mutineers.
But they stayed
So
home. But they stayed home instead.
yes, they stayed at home. That's the very, very Russian thing to do. And as a political scientist, I'm kind of glad that we have this good example to demonstrate what is authoritarian popularity. You remember all this talk about the support for the president, how the country is united behind him? So even compared to other autocrats like Erdogan, the Russian president cannot rely on, well, anyone except perhaps the FSO people, the Federal Guardsmen Service. They are or seem to be still around him.
Who can
So,
Putin
yeah.
rely on? Who can Putin rely on after these missteps, visible
Well,
missteps?
the bodyguard service, the FSO, uh, evidently he thinks he can rely on Rosgvardia and Zolotov because he is arming them. They are to receive, and there's a public promise on it, they are to receive heavy armament, which means that this armament will be taken from the front line or will not go to the front line because there's suddenly the realization that we actually need forces in Moscow, not somewhere out there in Ukraine, because we need to defend ourselves rather than think about getting our neighbors' land.
How far might this rebellion, if that's what it was, impact Russia's approach to the war in Ukraine?
That's a good question. If the idea that I have just tried to describe will take root in the minds of decision makers, it may lead to their, let's put it carefully, to their greater readiness to at least try to freeze the conflict or even to concede something for the sake of being able to stop those hostilities which are putting the very system at risk. The Russian expression for this is "не до жиру быть бы живо." We should not think about gain. We have trouble enough keeping ourselves alive. That's a very good frame of mind for the beginning of any sort of peace talks.
How far do you think Putin has scaled back his objectives in Ukraine, or is he still dreaming of taking Kiev?
It's not about taking Kiev per se. It's about installing a pro-Russian government in Ukraine. That's why there was so much talk about it's not being an occupational campaign. If there's a pro-Russian government in Kiev, there is absolutely no need for Russia to take any bit of Ukrainian territory because all Ukrainian territory will be pro-Russian. That's their idea. I cannot say whether it is still alive in the heads of anyone or not. But the very fact of annexating territory was due to the realization of the fact that no pro-Russian government in Kiev is forthcoming anytime soon.
And you don't see anybody still in the Kremlin dreaming of that? I mean, they haven't been characterized by their detailed knowledge or accurate knowledge of the situation in Ukraine, have they? And judging by events, it's not been very good.
We do not know. We do not know. And of course, we do not know whether anyone is dreaming about anything. I have the sense that the most optimistic scenario, which is now in the heads of Russian decision makers, is this. We wait out till Ukrainian counteroffensive peters out without tangible results. Then we wait out till presidential elections in the states, because we have all the time in the world, but the democracies are always chained to the electoral cycle. And then Donald the Savior will probably step forward and save Mother Russia. That's the idea, again, to the best of my estimation. I will not be defending it as a very realistic scenario, but I do suspect it's their favorite one.
That's really what some of them are counting on, a Trump victory in the US next year in the presidential elections?
Once you start dreaming, dream big.
Will Moscow have been heartened that Ukraine wasn't offered a timetable for joining NATO at the Vilnius summit?
Cannot really estimate that. These are military matters outside of the field of my expertise.
All right.
But what I know is that they're watching this very closely, and I know it not from some sort of insider sources, but from their open declarations. They're talking very much about it. So we can safely say that the eyes of Moscow are now all in Vilnius. By the way, good time to do something in Russia, maybe, when the eye of Sauron is turned elsewhere.
How long has Putin got to put things right? To reestablish to reestablish control?
Let's try to imagine this best case scenario. Suppose it all comes true. Counteroffensive achieves nothing. Vilnius summit ends with some sort of empty declaration. Donald Trump wins the presidential elections in 2024, and President Putin wins presidential elections in Russia in 2024 and no protests occur after the elections, because the danger of authoritarian elections is not losing them, but encountering public dissatisfaction after the results are being published, like in Belarus in 2020. Suppose all this happens, the conflict is frozen on the Korean model, which is now such a favorite with Russian public speakers, and then the regime has the time to readjust its logistical chains to further revamp its relations with both China and India, to isolate itself informationally from the global internet. And then, well, yes, it can survive for such time as the president has physically as a person, and then to try to rearrange matters once he is no longer among the group of elites, more or less the same people who are now the holders of the Russian Federation, the shareholders of this great and partially successful commercial enterprise. So this is the best case scenario. It is not an impossible one.
Ekaterina Schulmann, very good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.